Hello, my name is Wasserman, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about preservation of forensic evidence during medical treatment. So a little bit about some background for this topic. Essentially, this was chosen because it's an extremely prevalent and extremely important part of any criminal investigation and of forensic science as a whole. A lot of times, victims of crimes or subjects in investigations that are conducted have to receive some sort of medical treatment. So it is of interest to the law enforcement community and the forensics community to make sure that healthcare professionals are well trained and well versed in preservation and collection of forensic evidence. So some potential injuries of forensic interest. It's going to be any injury that's caused or brought on as a result of criminal activity. So this can include a plethora of things: interpersonal violence, so we're looking at just simple assaults or potentially even homicides, sexual assaults, unnatural deaths, any sort of medical malpractice could come into play, drug or alcohol dependence, potentially workplace injuries in terms of civil lawsuits, and also terrorist attacks and other various types of mass casualties. For healthcare professionals to identify injuries of forensic interest, it's important that they're well versed in looking for those red flags. So things that they should be keying into: potential traumatic illness or injury with no witnesses. This is especially prevalent with infant cases, either sudden infant death syndrome or shaken baby syndrome type cases. There's either no witnesses or witnesses who have a reason to lie about what might have happened. Any sort of delay in seeking medical attention. This comes into play with delayed reporting for sexual assaults in particular. Various injuries or various injured sites, multiple gunshot wounds, for example. Injuries of varying ages, so if there's sort of that pattern of abuse going on, again, especially with children, if you're seeing those healed fractures, that deep bone bruising or deep tissue bruising that's in various stages of healing. Any potential injury patterns, injuries that are inconsistent with an explanation could indicate some sort of child abuse, domestic abuse situation. And then just generally the suspicion of the medical provider. A lot of times the determination whether or not something might have forensic interest just falls to the intuition of the medical provider or the healthcare professional. So important steps in treatment, and these are key to remember for all healthcare professionals when they're dealing with those that are victims of crimes. Essentially to treat the body like a crime scene, and we in the forensic science community say this a lot at the crime scene, that the body is its own form of a crime scene and it needs to be treated as such. So with those healthcare professionals as well, especially because sometimes they can get that first look or that deeper look as opposed to law enforcement professionals who may be notified later, they need to take those super detailed notes, labeled diagrams, take measurements of any wounds or injuries, and then photographs as well. And on average, the healthcare professional might not necessarily be trained in forensic photography, but there are some people and some professions that are a little bit more well-versed that can take those photographs with potential ALS or different types of filters to really gather that best evidence. So a healthcare provider's role, and this kind of ties into why it's important for the healthcare providers to have knowledge on this topic. So first and foremost, they can be prosecuted for failure to cooperate with law enforcement. So in a situation where maybe they are notified of a potential victimization of a patient by law enforcement, they are by law required to essentially cooperate and do their best to gather the information that law enforcement is requesting. Like I mentioned before, the victim needs to be treated as a crime scene. And again, first and foremost, that healthcare provider is usually getting that first look at the victim, so they're able to gather that best evidence. And then the evidence collection in general. So especially with living victims, this is the role of the healthcare provider. A lot of times, crime scene investigators or forensic scientists of different sorts get that opportunity at a crime scene where they've got a decedent. They have all the time in the world, in theory, to process that body as a crime scene. But in terms of a living victim or a victim who might have come into a hospital and later passed away, the clock is kind of ticking. So that healthcare provider is really the first line of defense in terms of collecting that evidence. They've got the freshest fluids. They've got immediate access to essentially everything they need to collect those fluids, needles, the right sort of containers, and swabs, things of that nature. So types of evidence that can be collected. There's essentially 4 types that the healthcare professional should be honing in on, and the first is physical evidence. So we're looking for that tangible evidence. This could be things like clothing, it could be bullet fragments or a bullet itself. And the purpose of physical evidence is to assist in proving or disproving an allegation. And this is kind of one of those things that you would want that healthcare provider to hone in on so they're not collecting more than they should or less than they should. Trace evidence is small evidence, but it's measurable. Sometimes it's considered circumstantial, but these are things like hairs, fibers, soil, things of that nature that can be really difficult to determine if they are pertinent or not. And this is, again, where that interview of the victim, whenever possible, might come into play and might assist that healthcare provider in determining what they should take as evidence. Verbal evidence is the statement from a victim or from a subject, a patient that they're treating that's involved somehow in a criminal investigation, and these should always be recorded. A good example, at least in my experience, is working with the sexual assault nurse examiners, that they've always got the victim statements recorded and then they transcribe them word for word later, which is extremely helpful when that report comes out. Then there's also demonstrative evidence, so that's going to be those sketches and diagrams that the healthcare provider should be keeping up with, and then any photographs that they take as well. So evidence collection considerations. It would be ideal, obviously, for any healthcare provider to avoid altering any evidence throughout the course of their medical care, but especially if a victim or a subject of some type of crime comes into a hospital or a medical facility in some sort of emergent situation, their well-being is going to come first. It shouldn't be expected that evidence be preserved over the life of someone who might be housing that evidence. So first and foremost, for healthcare professionals, the patient is important. But anything they can do to avoid that alteration through that medical care, those steps should be taken. For example, trying not to create any additional tool marks on, let's say, a bullet. So if they're removing a bullet with some sort of other metal implement, they should take special care to try not to create additional tool marks. They should be drying any wet evidence or any biological evidence, properly labeling that evidence, packaging it, sealing it, storing it in a secure facility, just as any other crime scene investigator would. They, in this instance, are a crime scene investigator. So they should be keeping that chain of custody. They should make sure that all of their evidence is in a secure place so that there's no issues with admissibility if prosecution comes later. And because oftentimes healthcare professionals are not trained on crime scene investigation or other forms of forensic science, they should probably take too many samples or too much evidence rather than too few or too little, just to be on the safe side. So factors affecting that evidence collection and preservation is definitely how the patient comes in. Are they conscious? Are they living? Are they in an emergent medical care sort of situation? Also, other people that might be present. For example, if it's a domestic violence sort of situation, is the perpetrator of that domestic violence present? That could have an impact on how the healthcare professional is able to talk to the victim or collect evidence or testimony from that victim. And then also victim safety. So is the perpetrator of whatever violence they have suffered present, or are there any other imminent threats, for example. So the reason that this is important, and I hit on this a little bit before, is that it really tells the story of what happened. The victim's statement in particular is a great help. Obviously, if that victim is conscious, if they're unconscious or deceased, then the evidence sort of has to speak for itself, and the healthcare professionals are that first line. They have the first shot at that evidence, so they have the best sight picture of what might have happened. It helps further criminal investigations, can help in prosecution, and then it's, like I mentioned before, potentially the only chance to collect evidence depending on the circumstances. All right, so I've got my references here, and then questions if you've got any. And now I'll go into my creative element. So what I've done is I have created a website, and it's called Sealed. So it's a forensic resource for medical professionals. So essentially, the idea behind this website is that healthcare professionals could come to this website. It's a one-stop shop for all things forensic medicine. And two of the main features of the website is that there are reference materials. So I'll click on that page. So essentially, here's some reference materials, some materials that I read in preparation of this presentation that really gave me a good idea of this topic and all that goes into it. So those references are available all here, and the bibliography or reference page is also available at the bottom of this page. And then the claim to fame of Sealed is the interactive checklist. So this is essentially something that medical professionals can use to help them in the situation that they have with a patient or with a victim. Let's say they've got a victim that comes in. It's somehow related to a criminal investigation, whether they've been notified by the victim themselves, whether law enforcement has notified them, a witness has notified them. They can pull up this website, and it helps kind of walk them through the process. So it would take a very long time to click through all of the buttons, but I'll just have sort of a hypothetical patient going through, and I'll walk through how a healthcare professional would use this website. So there's kind of that disclaimer caveat here. As with any checklist, this one is not all-encompassing. Every patient and every scenario is different. Use our interactive checklist to help you along the way, but always refer to your judgment and experience. So starting here, does the patient need urgent medical treatment? Let's just say yes. Let's say that they come in some sort of emergency situation, and you can't necessarily talk to them right away. So we'll click yes. So this lets them know patient well-being comes first. Treat the patient. If you notice any indications of victimization or items of evidentiary value, document and collect them appropriately. So this is assuming that the patient has been treated, but that they notice something of evidentiary value, either an injury or potential physical piece of evidence. So the first thing that they'll do is essentially work on that documentation. So the photography, those diagrams, and then the evidence collection. So they would click here for some help with photography. We've got some tips here. The first thing is a victim consent to photograph form. So again, assuming that victim is conscious, there is a form right here, and it actually takes them right to it there. So if the victim is ill, unconscious, or otherwise unable to consent, keep in mind that implied consent can apply in certain situations. Consult the appropriate authority for more information. Next, photograph all wounds at intermediate and close-up range, including a photograph with a scale. So they can click here for an example of an intermediate and a close-up wound photograph. And then they will click here for some more information on documentation. So in terms of documentation, pretty much anything that they could need in terms of forms is right here. So we've got body diagrams and certain body part diagrams as well for various ages, infant, children, and adult male and female. And then going back to here, clicking here for help with that evidence collection. So we've got several sections here: personal protective equipment, processing or packaging evidence, labeling evidence, sealing evidence, and then evidence storage and security. So as an example, we'll go to sealing evidence. So this lets them know, place tamper evident tape across all openings of your evidence container, initial and date halfway on the evidence tape and halfway on the evidence container so the tape cannot be removed or replaced. So they can click here to view an example. So we've got this diagram here that essentially illustrates what I just explained. And then when they go back to this page, there's an option to click to return to the evidence collection page. So this takes them back out to that main menu so they can go through all of these different pages on PPE, packaging evidence, labeling evidence, sealing it, and then storage and security. And then there is, on that reference materials page, a place for feedback. At the bottom, there's always that option to join the mailing list. And there are places within the website to email me to essentially ask any questions or request information be updated on the site. So this is not as specific and in-depth as it could be, but it definitely gives a good overview for those healthcare professionals and gives them a good reference place, sort of a one-stop shop for everything that they need in a forensic situation. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time and have a good day.